Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second in this series of Chalmers Lectures. I'm George White. I'm the Principal Clerk of the General Assembly, and one of the many prizes that come with that is I get to be the Chair of the Chalmers Lectureship Trust. I said last night, and for those of you who weren't here last night, it's worth saying again, we were delighted that we were able to get Sam to come from St Martin-in-the-Fields and be our lecturer this series. There's a lecture tonight, obviously, which is why we're here, and tomorrow night, and then we have a week's gap, and then there's another 3 lectures at the very start of October. It's also worth saying that we are joined online tonight by many people. The lectures are available on the Church of Scotland website. You can see last night's through a link. And tonight's will go on somewhere about midnight, and you can replay it, or indeed encourage your friends and colleagues to have a look. So the format's a wee bit different tonight in terms of we're going to the lecture, then we'll have a bit of time for questions. There's then a glass of wine available if you go underneath the organ through that way, a chance to chat informally. There's also a bookstall, which the Cornerstone have provided. It's got a lot of Sam's books. I don't know when Sam finds the time to write all these books, but he does, and people are keen to have them. They're available. So the wine time is a time to chat and to have a look at what's available there. So I don't want to take up any more time. You don't want me to take up any more time. I'd like to welcome back to the lectern Rev Dr Sam Wells. Sam.
Thank you, George, and thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you again for the great privilege and honour of being invited to do these lectures. The lectures are dedicated to Ali Lime, a dear friend, sadly missed. I'm going to take my argument in 4 stages. I'm going to start by suggesting that the New Testament call to discipleship is an all-embracing thing, that following Jesus requires our heart and mind and soul and strength. I'm then going to look at how the Church has found it hard to live that call in practice and has adapted its ways to what we might call a partial approach. Then I'm going to suggest that any solution to the Church's present woes about money that are based on a partial approach are unlikely to succeed, given that they're seeking to restore what I take to be a flawed model. Finally, I'll suggest what might be a renewed, all-embracing model that might give hope and reignite the imagination of our conversation about money. For our discussion about money, there's only one place to start, and that's with Jesus' call to discipleship, follow me. The Gospels play out the implications of Jesus' apparently simple invitation. For Jesus, it means the formation of a community of committed disciples, sharing with them his trials and challenges as well as his wisdom and instruction. It means fellowship with those on whom the world has turned its back, both abiding among them and allowing his presence alongside one among them to change that person's life or circumstances forever. And it means coming into conflict with those in authority, those who are holding the people of God to ransom, and those who are keeping the coming kingdom of God in chains. This threefold ministry calls for threefold imitation. Disciples are called to belong to an accountable community that stays close to Jesus, listens to his voice and seeks to know his ways. They're called to be with the poor, sharing the experience of exclusion, allowing their lives to be changed by encounter with those in whom Christ promised to show his face, and on occasion finding ways to offer tangible assistance as people change their own reality for the better. And they are called to come into lively encounter with those in authority, holding such people to account and looking for their conversion or for their rediscovery of God's kingdom and its expectations. Jesus' call to leave material security behind is uncompromising and persistent. He has no time for a person who wants first to bury his father or who wants to keep his talent safely buried in the ground, or who has just bought a piece of land and must go out and see it, or who has bought 5 yoke of oxen and is going to try them out, or who has just got married and is preoccupied. In this context, his celebrated encounter with the young man variously described as rich or a ruler stands out as a stark moment in a consistent trajectory. Jesus says to the man, "Go sell what you own and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, then come follow me." As one commentator puts it, the two obligations, that this man should sell what he has and therefore become free for God, and that he should give it to the poor and therefore become free for his neighbor, both derive their meaning and force from this final demand that he should come and follow Jesus. It's often pointed out that it was hard for the man to part with things to which he was very much attached. But we don't often ask, how was he to live once he'd done so? This is a question that was focused in the ministry of St. Francis of Assisi. Francis responded to Jesus' uncompromising call by making himself socially vulnerable and divesting himself of political and military power. What Francis was doing was taking Jesus' radical summons and turning it into a social vision that at the same time renewed the church. Francis's begging was about publicly calling forth gifts that would reveal Christ's church. At the same time, he was developing a form of social holiness based not on exchange and competition, but on voluntary sacrifice and charity. His renunciation of property meant he could never be drawn into the most common form of social conflict, one that arises when one person defends their property rights against another's. His poverty was a form of economic unilateral disarmament. St. Francis goes, sells, gives to the poor, and then comes and follows Jesus. Simple as that. And within the conscience of many clergy, I would guess, if not within the conscience of most of the lay people they serve, is a nagging suspicion that perhaps we should be doing the same. For this is what true imitation of Christ looks like. But it turned out not to be so simple for the Franciscans. Francis's model was poisoned by its own popularity. If godly poverty was the highest status, all worldly and especially churchly hierarchies were under threat. If the world was awash with voluntary beggars, not only were economic beggars displaced, but begging became a new marketplace of rhetoric and deceit. This was a realm not of God, but of anarchy and scandalous abuse, as the 14th century poem Piers Plowman exposes. The church's gifts, notably confession, had become a racket. But the model of St. Francis and Jesus' words to the rich young ruler are not the only words that have had a hold on the church's imagination when it comes to money. Equally influential are these words from the last part of Acts chapter 2. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Not your average Kirk session or PCC or vestry meeting. It's worth breaking this down, this ideal picture down, into its constituent elements. There is first the discovery of and formation in faith, the apostles' teaching. Then there is time spent with one another, building one another up and deepening support and encouragement, fellowship. Third, there's sacramental worship, the breaking of bread. And fourth, there are other dimensions of worship, the prayers. Fifth, there are amazing acts of God which bring awe on everyone. Sixth, there is the sharing of goods with one another. And seventh, there is the selling of goods and distribution to those in need. And that's about it. The tangible results are goodwill among the people and a growth in the size of the community. In the background is the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and the constant sense that the church is more than the sum of its parts, that with Jesus, scarcity becomes abundance. This image has had a powerful hold on the imagination of many Christians. There's a perpetual sense that if we were doing it properly, we'd be sharing washing machines and having childcare cooperatives and sitting down for constant community meals. But it's important to note that this is a different picture from Jesus' words to the rich young man. The rich young man model is about living vulnerably before God and simply following Jesus. The Acts 2 model is about making a collective commitment and finding the activity of the Holy Spirit in the worship and practices of a community. Both models are compelling, but they're not the same. The two dominant kinds of medieval monasticism, the mendicant friars and the wealthy monasteries, represented these two poles of engaging with the ideal of somehow getting money right. The mendicant friars imitated the rich young man, and the Benedictine monasteries imitated the Acts 2 ideal community. But both models turned out to be flawed when translated into a vision for a whole society. The friars evoked anarchy, while the monasteries generated corruption, wealth, and hypocrisy. Nonetheless, many clergy and others feel deep down they ought to have gone, sold up, given to the poor, and come and followed Jesus, living a simple life of prayer and service and relying on alms. Meanwhile, many Christian communities aspire to a noble ideal of shared possessions, or at least in part, a common purse. So that's my first point. The gospel call is for wholehearted commitment in a way that transcends conventional notions of family and ignores preoccupations about making a living. It offers two compelling models, itinerant mendicancy and intense community, that are not wholly compatible with one another, but were in different ways lived out in the Middle Ages and still have a hold on the church's imagination about money today. My second point is that for the most part, the church has found these two models too challenging to be implemented and too disruptive to be sustainable, not least because they dismantle familial and economic expectations that the church over the centuries has felt it couldn't live without. Two other models have emerged that broadly encompass the church's consensus about money. The first and earliest is what we might call the benefactor model. The logic of the benefactor model goes like this. I am not willing or able to make the kind of commitment of the monk or the mendicant, but I want the church to flourish, I want to be close to God, and I want myself and my loved ones to go to heaven. So I will subcontract the achievement of these goals to those who have made such all-encompassing commitments, and I will finance their flourishing. The epitome of the benefactor model is the medieval practice of saying masses for the dead. Churches, and especially monasteries, grew, flourished, and came to rely on income from precisely this source. But more generally, the benefactor model is tied into a class structure of squirearchy, and ethos of noblesse oblige, and a dualist material-spiritual divide where the church in general, and the clergy more specifically, exist in large part to cleanse the earthly, fleshly world of its more unrefined qualities and make it fit to stand before God. Consider a conventional village church fundraising campaign. The regular congregation may be small, and their resources not infinite. They have two sources of appeal, to the wider village and to the occupier of the sprawling old rectory, old manse, or ancient restored manor house. Both of these appeals rest on a benefactor model. They both assume a vicarious structure in which non-churchgoers value the presence of the church building and regular worship in the community and wish to see it continue even if they anticipate playing little or no part in it. This isn't a chantry system involving the payment of considerable sums for the saying of masses for the dead, but it's on a continuum with that previous system. The message is still that we are doing something not just for ourselves, but also for you. The role of the parish priest, particularly in village communities, still rests on benefactor assumptions. For example, the expectation of parish visiting is culturally and historically tied to the understanding that the priest had access to benevolent funds that could turn pastoral concern for the afflicted into material assistance for their well-being. Benefaction rests on a social system dominated by class, patronage, and relationships of unspoken obligation. The other model that has shaped the imagination of the Church precisely because it doesn't demand wholehearted commitment is what we may call the stewardship model. You can't understand the stewardship model unless you grasp the degree to which the Reformation laicized the Church. Prior to the Reformation, the normative ethical agent was a monk or priest. After the Reformation, the normative ethical agent became a layperson who owned disposable wealth and most likely was engaged in profitable business. Christianity was democratized, or at least made a bourgeois phenomenon. The conventional vocation was to use God's beneficence to care effectively for human needs. If one were to experience growth or increase, one should consider such blessings characteristic of that effectiveness. The crucial thing to notice is that Jesus' words to the rich young man drop out of the scene altogether. Poverty, voluntary or communal, is ruled out. Since persons don't own goods but are given charge of them for efficient use, renunciation is a refusal to take up the moral responsibility God has given them. It's interesting to note that stewardship is a peculiarly English word. Spanish, for example, has no single term for the concept, and German sometimes simply italicizes the English word steward. In Tyndale's 1534 translation of the New Testament, the term steward is only used once. But the concept had taken hold by the 18th century, largely because of the influence of John Wesley. Wesley's famous slogan was, "Gain all you can, save all you can, give all you can." Kelly Johnson notes, as a guideline for determining what to use on oneself, Wesley teaches people to consider themselves simply the first in a number of poor they must care for. Hence, a Christian should care for himself or herself as for the poor by tending to necessities and nothing beyond. The kind of renunciation that would make a person a beggar is considered reprehensible, for one's first duty is to frugal self-preservation. As Wesley noted, admitting himself to be rich, it is not possessing wealth, but possessing more than is employed according to God's will that is the problem. As Wesley vividly put it, if I leave behind me £10 above my debts and the little arrears of my fellowship, you and all mankind bear witness against me that I lived and died a thief and a robber. Wesley's 19th century successors, particularly in the United States, took this healthy legacy in two significant directions. The narrative of the man who grew wealthier after he made a commitment to give generously attained mythic dimensions, and Wesley's insistence that the wealth must be gained justly fades from the scene. But notice this rules out voluntary or communal poverty altogether. If we have no money, we can't care for the poor, as a Methodist named Margaret Thatcher once famously pointed out, not a mile from where I'm standing today. So this is my second point. The two compelling scriptural models were replaced by two alternative models that suited the sociology of the church in different times. Just as Francis had adopted the individual character of the Mark X model, so the benefactor took on the same mantle in a new, less sacrificial age. And just as the Benedictines had taken on the Acts II model in the Middle Ages, so after the Reformation, the steward became the representative of collective action in pursuit of a common goal. These two models didn't make the demands of the two scriptural models. They recognized that people sought to live conventional lives, with families, careers, regular sources of income, and perhaps even some habits of life that sat outside the church's official ethic. But these two models have given us the church we have today. My third point is that it may be that these two models have run their course. If one were to try to diagnose the money question as it pervades the sleepless nights of those responsible for church finance on a local, regional, or national level, one might put it like this. The established church was largely founded and for many centuries run on the benefactor model. Some decades ago, the sums ceased to add up. It's important to note that this isn't primarily about real or perceived falls in congregation size, because under the benefactor model, congregation size isn't especially important in how money works in the church. It's about sociological changes, like how long retired clergy live, what constitutes reasonable provision for people in their retirement, whether the noblesse feel as obliged as they used to, given that the ancient aristocracy are not so fixed in their estates as once they were, and the shift of the majority of the population to the cities, where relationships of unspoken obligation are different from the abiding practice of the country. And so what's happened in the last 2 or 3 generations is that a church whose money rested fundamentally on the system and legacy of squirearchy has morphed into a church that rests on congregationalism. By congregationalism, I mean the assumption that the basic unit of Christianity is the local church, that each local church should seek to be self-sufficient as regards the provision of its stipendiary ministry, building upkeep, and additional administrative and liturgical costs, and that those costs should be met almost entirely through the voluntary stewardship of members of its congregation. What I want to point out is that this kind of congregationalism is a new development for the established church, that while it has many good features, it also has some negative side effects, and that the increasingly evident failure of this model to deliver what the church currently needs should not be a cause of wistful lament or hand-wringing despair, but a call to a renewal of the church through the catalyst of money. Let's start with the good features. Congregationalism is a long way from the Acts 2 model of holding all things in common. But it does set up a healthy dynamism by which people practice their faith that God has given them everything they need to worship and follow in the way of Jesus Christ. At its best, congregationalism affirms that money is always God's, not ours, that the more one gives, the more one cares, and that giving makes the relationships of community essential. Giving the first significant percentage of one's income certainly pays for the administration of the Christian community, underwriting its expenses, supporting its mission, and alleviating hardship. And such giving frequently demonstrates sacrificial love, answering and echoing the sacrificial love of God. But deeper than that, and at its very best, congregational stewardship discloses that money is always a gift, always an instrument to serve a greater end, and never a goal, never an end in itself. Money becomes a means of establishing and maintaining relationships, rather than a method of bypassing relationships, or an insurance in case relationships go wrong. Its primary purpose is to engraft disciples in community by transforming their politics from the politics of scarcity, paying the bills, to a politics of abundance. In deliberating over how to invest the surplus gifts of God, the community learns to identify the places and ways God works in the world, and how best to follow where God has led. The translation of common faith and common vision into a common purse concentrates the minds and hearts of disciples, such that every gift they make is evaluated for faithfulness and accompanied by prayer. Beyond building community and deepening faith, the other good feature of congregational stewardship is its simplicity and transparency. If the complex commands and expectations of discipleship are confusing and bewildering, it's a great relief to be told, tithe your pre-tax earnings, or even your post-tax earnings, and regard that as a minimum standard for your giving in general. And it's pretty obvious whether people are doing so or not. There's a lot to be said for prayerful consideration of how much to give, but there's even more to be said for a simple commitment to give 10% and not go into the details. Just take the issue off your desk. We can't live life in a whirlwind of choice. Some of the biggest things in life are those we just decide to do and stick to. If those are the positive features of congregational stewardship, the negative features come down to 3, and they're all characteristics of money matters in general. The first is the tendency to shrink the mission of the church to the priorities of those with the largest wallets. One reason the mainline denominations in the United States are in perpetual tension is that most of their clergy take a progressive view of issues surrounding sexuality, while many members with the largest wallets take a more conservative view. Whatever one's commitments around sexuality questions in the church today, it can't be right that one simply gets the doctrine one pays for. But in a congregational model, it's almost inevitable that those who give the most assume they get to shout the loudest. Second is that the more self-sufficient a congregation becomes, the more irrelevant the diocese or oversight body seems to be. Almost inevitably, the parish share, or whatever it's called, comes to feel like a tax, and financially healthy congregation comes to affiliate more closely with those of a like mind than with others of a similar postcode and under the same jugatory. What this means is that by promoting congregational stewardship in the last 3 generations, the diocese or oversight body has been almost unavoidably advancing its own perceived irrelevance. Third is the assumption, indeed the conviction, that stewardship is fundamentally about money. In John Wesley's view, money is that precious talent which contains all the rest. Through the mechanism of money, he believed, people might exercise all 6 works of mercy set out in Matthew 25. But as I've already suggested, money is never more than a device for creating relationships. And once one has those relationships, the money is secondary. God's abundance is located in the relationships, not in the money. I consider myself blessed to have had 7 years' experience of living in a culture where the church has all the things the church in the United Kingdom thinks it needs: numbers, money, and social influence. But it turns out that the kingdom of God is no closer. What I discovered from 7 years living in the American South is that numbers, money, and influence are as often an obstacle to discovering the grace and the kingdom of God as they are an entry point. This is my third point. The established church is in a financial plight because it has shifted somewhat abruptly from a benefactor model which affirmed hierarchies, enshrined mixed motives, was hopelessly tied to an outdated class and patronage system, and yet directed the church's attention to the whole parish, the whole nation, and the wider goods of the kingdom, to a stewardship model that can galvanize a congregation but tends to narrow the notion of mission, impoverish the texture of a diocese, and overvalue the power of money compared to relationship. And the new model doesn't pay the bills. But I don't believe this should be a cause for unbounded lament, because I'm not sure it was a truly scriptural model in the first place. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with a conventional church approach to congregational giving that appeals to 3 dimensions: God, church, and kingdom. Such an approach starts by dismantling the question, why should I spend my money on the church? Such a question is based on a misunderstanding. The first mistake is to speak of my money. Property rights are a convention of civilized society, but they're fundamentally based on a falsehood. Things don't belong to us. They belong to God. Like everything else, money is something we look after for a while, but can't ultimately keep. The choice is not whether to hang on to it or give it away, it's who to give it to. That's why the word spend is also wrong. Spend is a verb that offers a sense of power, a sense of executive control that can make things happen, or acquire possessions by dispensing money. But that's not actually what happens. What people actually do is invest money. Every act that we call spending is in fact taking a risk, that this bar of chocolate will make us happy, that this newspaper will keep us informed and entertained, that this car will be more worth than its trouble, that this house will be a comfort and not a millstone. If we use the word spend, we hide the reality of that risk. If we replace spend with invest, then we recognize we can't control the outcomes of our risky ventures, and we broaden our imaginations to consider what really lasts forever. And that leads us to God, because God is more or less synonymous with forever. Christians believe in a personal God, but the most basic understanding of God would be that which lasts forever. If we're in the investment business, which we all are, why wouldn't we invest in that which lasts forever? It makes all other investment look absurdly short-term. If we return to the question, why should I spend my money on the church, another word that's wrong is should. Giving isn't a guilt trip. It's a recognition that no one can buy the things that really matter: love, joy, peace, and finally, salvation. If they were for sale, no one would be able to afford them, not even the 1% of the world that are richer than the rest put together. Love, joy, and peace are glorious gifts, and they've been given not to those who deserve them, but to people like us who squander them all the time. God has given us everything we need. We can spend our money either out of gratitude or in constructing an impregnable empire that doesn't need God. That's not about should, about duty, about obligation. That's about overflow, about joy, about celebrating amazing grace. The law of exchange, where one person has goods and services and another person buys them, only works for transitory things. When we're dealing with forever, we need to revert to another system. And the name of that system is gift. The more you transfer resources from the market economy into the gift economy, the more you're starting to enter eternal life. It's not about duty, it's about joy. It's as well to acknowledge that this goes against many instincts we're born with, like self-preservation, and many habits we're trained in, like putting oneself first. Here lies the significance of John Wesley's advice: consider yourself the first among the poor you are called to serve. It recognizes that we have deep, pressing, and real needs, and only when those needs are met can we relax and live for others. But it assumes that these needs can be met, and life isn't about amassing more and more wealth, comfort, and security to keep the ravages of the world at bay. The economy of gift believes that generosity is the best investment. Hoarding goods and living in constant anxiety is, in the end, idolatry, because it's investing too much worth in something less than God. It's not so much wrong as foolish and sad. Then there is the word church. The word church is wrong if it's taken to mean something that's separate from ourselves and separate from God. Those who believe in the economy of gift, investing in forever, want to be part of the body of Christ, the embodiment of eternal grace. So all their money should lie with the church, minus the part they hold back as they consider themselves first among the poor they're called to serve. But that's incomprehensible if it isn't simply a way of investing in God. That doesn't mean not paying taxes, because taxes provide the ordered government that makes freedom possible and the basic services that make life livable. It doesn't mean not giving to charities, because charities provide the concrete acts of mercy for which a majority in a democracy would not vote. It doesn't mean living a life of begging and destitution, because Jesus instructs us to love not only God and our neighbor, but also ourselves. And loving ourselves is part of the way we show our gratitude to God. But it does mean that for Christians, their whole lives are oriented to the economy of gift and investing in forever. And the word for the place where gift and forever meet is church. There's nothing more inspiring than being among a bunch of people who committed to living in the economy of grace and invested in the church and are resting on the providence of God. God isn't a distant and arbitrary landlord who is twice a year summoned to fix the plumbing. God is the one who's invested everything in the church and who invites the church to invest everything in return. If faith isn't alive, it's usually because little has been invested in it. Church is not just a tangible way to invest in God. It's a tangible way people invest in each other. It's sometimes a cause of lament that spouses and partners argue so much about money. But it's inevitable because money is the most tangible way people identify and demonstrate what they value in life. Those with whom we share a bank account is a bigger social statement than those with whom we share a bed. Sharing a bank account means you have to explain and fight and persuade and ask and beg and share and forgive, which are all the things that make a relationship. They're also all the things that make a church. Church is supposed to be a herald and advance foretaste of the kingdom. Whether it employs one person or several, it needs to practice what it preaches. Few congregations in the United Kingdom are rich. Most congregation members have followed a path in life that brought no great financial reward, or have faced obstacles in life that depleted what resources they might otherwise have accrued. But kingdom means things like a greater income equality, environmental sustainability, fair trade. To bring such things about in our nation requires huge political will, which we can hope and pray and strive to foster. But to practice such things in a church requires additional investment. There's only one way to do that, and that's for congregational giving to fill the gap in the balance sheet created by the church's trying to turn its convictions into action. A congregation can't call for government, business, and civil society to live its values unless it's prepared to face the cost of living them itself. There's only one thing wrong with this conventional appeal. It doesn't work. At least, it doesn't work in the large majority of congregations in the United Kingdom today. It's time for a new approach. Let's put together what we've seen in the arguments so far. The two scriptural models are demanding because they dismantle conventional, familial, and economic expectations that the church over the centuries felt it couldn't live without. They have always been practiced by a minority and still are today. In place of them, the church pursued two other models, that of benefactor and steward, that fitted more comfortably with the familial and economic realities the church was resolved to accept. These are the models that are coming to grief today. We talk as if they were the only models, but they're both profoundly flawed, and neither does full justice to the way the Bible talks about money as the stimulus to the renewal of relationships, rather than as a mechanism for navigating the shortcomings of relationships. If we return to the Gospels, for example, in the parable of the steward in Luke chapter 16, we can see Jesus inaugurating an inspiring transformation in relationships that's stimulated by, but not limited to, a transformation in the use of money. What does this mean for us as a church? Well, there's no reason to give up on benefaction and stewardship straight away. They both have their place, and they may function differently in rural and urban areas, in gathered and neighborhood contexts. The conventional appeal that I offered earlier is still right in almost every respect. But there's also this principle: God gives us the abundance of the kingdom to renew the poverty of the church. In other words, if the church is a cul-de-sac or a quagmire, it's time to invest in the kingdom. The experience of one congregation may be instructive. At St Martin-in-the-Fields in London, the benefactor model was still in place longer than most urban churches. Built by George I in a blend of architectural styles that affirmed the union of England and Scotland in 1707, and especially of Britain and Hanover in 1714, The vicars of St Martin's had generally been well connected. A timely call to a grandee, even a royal, in times of hardship would tide things over till the next shortfall. By the 1980s, the sums didn't add up. The costs of the building and the extensive outreach ministry far exceeded the albeit significantly undertapped potential of congregational stewardship. The answer was to create a commercial enterprise. The then vicar, Geoffrey Brown, had long been interested in the workplace, not just as a source of income. He and his team were flexible in trying out ways the church buildings might be made amenable to generating significant profits. The results a generation later have been remarkable. St Martin's has been able to maintain and expand its ability to extend its mission well beyond the imaginations of its wealthiest and most generous members and donors. But there's more to it than that. Originally, the food services, retail, events, and commercial concerts were seen in largely instrumental terms to underwrite the lofty spiritual mission and ministry of the church. But what's happened is that the business has ended up teaching the congregation a lot about the kingdom. Its 120 staff hail from 25 countries. The commercial enterprise is a microcosm of a multicultural society. Meanwhile, St Martin's now sees itself as a community of hope, reimagining church and society through culture, charity, commerce, and congregational life. It's a vision of a civil economy, of what work and play, friendship and worship, social concern and evangelism, diversity and identity might look like. St Martin's has the advantage of being in Trafalgar Square and having a huge quantity of tourist traffic. This also brings disadvantages: a huge cost of a building maintenance and security, a large insurance bill, and occasions when the agenda of a major outdoor public gathering space dictates what's possible indoors. But flourishing life is not all about existing potential. Look at Switzerland. No natural resources, so it tries banking and watches. Those are both still going pretty well. But the point I want to stress is that St Martin's success has come out of adversity, out of near bankruptcy. The financial imperative proved to be a good thing. It renewed the church. And the business is now an integral part of the church's life. If you have senior staff members who are Jewish or Muslim, you don't say their staff subcontracted to deliver services. They're wearing a St Martin-in-the-Fields polo shirt like everyone else, and St Martin's has to adapt its notion of church to accommodate the kingdom that God is giving it. That kingdom is about living God's future now, modeling in social relations the activities and company the church anticipates in heaven. The sociological point is this. In 1948, a revolution took place in this country, in which the state became the church. The state took over a lot of the things the church used to do. The church had to decide what it was going to be. It chose to reinvent itself as offering something called spirituality. And what happened was that it ceased to require the services of those whose spirituality was more practically oriented. And the people most churches attract are, for the most part, those who are happy to receive spirituality. But churches no longer see those who find perfect freedom in doing practical things. St. Martin still sees such people because it still has voluntary and paid jobs for them to do. Today, the state is having second thoughts. It isn't at all sure it wants to be the church anymore. It's a really exciting time to be the church. But in order to enjoy its possibilities, the church has to believe it's about more than spirituality and has to let its financial needs and the material poverty of many it encounters become entry points to new adventures, new relationships, new discoveries in God's kingdom. For example, just imagine if a rural parish didn't go cap in hand to the neo-gentry in the old manse once every 4 years, looking for £10,000 to help with a new church roof, but instead asked for a loan of a project manager to create a business plan to make a sustainable income for the congregation. It might give the resident of the old manse a worthy place to locate a loyal employee close to retirement, but more broadly, it could galvanize the whole village to get behind a common project. Either way, it would be likely to elicit a much more engaged response from the old manse. The Old Testament was written because God's people in exile found it not a time of despair, but one of renewal. Not a time simply of losing the land, but more wonderfully of gaining a new and deeper relationship with God. The New Testament was written because the early Christians found that the execution of their Lord and Savior was not the end of the story, but the beginning, that his agony was the foretaste of glory, that his killers meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. The logic is clear. Let's take this time of financial heart-searching in our church and see it as a gift for the clarifying of the gospel, the renewing of the church, and the rediscovery of the kingdom. Make money your friend in the business of making friends. Remember that generosity is the best investment. Let God show you the kingdom, and let that kingdom renew the church. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Lots to think about. I've heard it before, and it was still good. Thank you. So, we've some time for questions, both here and through the miracle of the internet, those who are joining us in their homes or wherever they're watching and listening. So, John's got a roving microphone and a connection.
Can I ask something? Sam, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, look, thank you very much indeed. Listening to you, you were telling us a story, a narrative about formation of church and, in a sense, the rise, fall, and rise again of a healthy understanding of church. Okay. Now, the mechanism by which you told this story was through one commodity, namely money. Could I, and I don't want this to be a distraction because it's a peculiar question perhaps, could I ask you if you could think, possibly not now, but at least sometime, about playing this story again, but using a different commodity, and that commodity being truth. That truthfulness in the sense of blunt outspokenness said to another can be withering, but might be claimed as a fundamental Christian gift. Gradually, people learned, we all learned perhaps, to shutter truth. We learn habits, practices of kindness and tact. We distance ourselves from the blistering outspokenness, okay? Habits emerge. But today we live in an era in which there is too much truth. We see identity politics in which everybody is true, everybody claims that they're speaking truth, and they tear the fabric of society apart. Okay, so truth is another commodity through which you can tell an alternative or augmentative story. That's a possibility.
Well, that's a really stimulating challenge. I just two responses to that. One that goes in the same direction as the question, and the other that modifies the question a bit, I suppose. Andrew Shanks is a theologian that some people will know, based in Manchester, and he has a vision for the Church of England in an English context as what he calls a pioneeringly honest ex-oppressor church, which he's thinking, I mean, he narrates that particularly in relation to the church's relationship with the Jews, not as a German problem, but as a British problem, narrating anti-Semitism within the church, not just as wider society, over a period of 1,000 years at least. And of course, the phrase pioneeringly honest ex oppressor church brings to mind the colonial and imperial history, which is quite striking. I remember being with a former student while watching an American former student while watching the London Olympics, just trotting down rather quaintly from the St Martin's morning service to watch the marathon go through Trafalgar Square. A rather wonderful experience, that never to be repeated probably. And she came from the American South, and she said, well, all over the American South, people are, pulling down statues and putting up new memorials and questioning their history of slavery. Where does that happen in Britain? So, of course, I said, well, we don't really have a difficult history to come to terms with. So that's your problem, really, which we're very fortunate not to have. So I think we could be, entering an era where the church at the moment, the church's truthfulness is sadly about still inadequately narrating its own abuse of children. And in some ways, its ability to come to terms with what it's done and not see it wholly or largely in terms of financial settlements, but in terms of recognizing not just the guilt, but the complicity. And somehow the complicity is becoming almost a bigger deal than the guilt as that story is playing out. And the fact that it isn't an ancient history issue, it's a present tense issue, and it's a last few years issue. And it's going to be a next plenty years issue unless the church goes through the rigorous truth-telling process you described. So that all of that's in the same trajectory as your question. The one way in which I think I just gently challenge the question is by just reiterating something I kind of said earlier in the presentation, which is that if you want to know what somebody really believes in, you need to check where they're putting their money. So I think money can be quite a test of people's sense of truth in terms of the actual depth of their convictions. It doesn't take a child to say to a parent, if you really believe in addressing climate change, why don't you invest your money accordingly? So money is a test of truth in a way, and that's why I think your vision and my proposal converge.
Questions?
You talk about the church becoming involved in social enterprise, and of course we're doing this at Greyfriars, and it's a model we have great sympathy with. But here's the question: how does a social enterprise feel different from any other enterprise? How is your cafe different from a normal cafe, and how is our cafe? How should somebody coming into our cafe down the hill feel that it's a social enterprise and is part of our ministry, if you like, and not just a normal kind of money-making enterprise?
Well, I'm now going to give the most annoying answer that I think it's possible to give, which is that is the subject of my next lecture. So you have to come back tomorrow to hear the answer to that question. But that's exactly what the third lecture in the series is about. Probably not the answer you wanted to hear.
Anyone else want to raise something at the moment? Anything online, John? Okay. Alison.
You, from time to time, slipped from talking about property to talking about money being a form of property. But as you were talking, I was looking around this building, and we're facing our 400th anniversary. I mean, sort of in line with Ian's question, you know, what would that historic trajectory look like if you were talking about other forms of property rather than just money? It would miss out, as you say, on this idea that where people put their money shows you what they mean, what they care about. But there's also another story there, isn't there, about property, and it interacts with the money one as well.
Sorry, could you repeat the last one?
There's also a story about property and the way in which that historically has bound the church or has released it in various ways. But it is also tied up with money, so it's not just a simple question.
Yes, it's a very subtle and very appropriate question, which obviously would take another lecture to address properly. But just to begin with a kind of theological account of property in the spirit, I suppose, that you're describing, and that would be the ambivalence through a lot of the Old Testament about whether or not to build a temple, which reflects the ambivalence about whether Israel was really truly itself when it was a people that kept animals and therefore was not settled, or when it was truly itself when it was a people that grew crops, and whether actually it became more prone to idolatry when it grew crops because it started to worship the sun and the seasons. And likewise, it was closer to God, possibly in the wilderness and in exile, than it was, you know, at the height of its powers in Solomon's time with the splendors of the temple and the kind of complacency and the losing the plotness that ended up entailing, according to the Old Testament account. The New Testament seems to answer that question quite clearly. No abiding city. That the only settled state was the eternal, heavenly settled state. And that's a judgment on any investment in a kind of physical permanence. But as with a lot of the New Testament, the church has found a way around that, and for quite understandable reasons. Last night we talked about the significance of institutions and how you remain infantilized if you don't create institutions to pass on wisdom from past to future through the generations. And likewise, the investment in a wonderful building like Greyfriars is a statement that there is a truth that we are investing in, and that we are going to give our first tithe, you know, that we're all going to give the best of our crops to create a place for the worship of God, not just for us, but for generations that we won't see. And that's an incredibly faithful and wonderful gesture. However, if you've made that gesture in Norfolk, where that building is now 3 miles from the nearest habitation and is grade 1 listed, and yet has no obvious purpose for a worshipping congregation, you haven't really given a blessing to future generations or necessarily really glorified God. You've just created a major problem. And I think that's a problem that requires a lot of imagination and humanity to address. In my view, you have to think of how that property can become a blessing for others. And I would say every large dwelling, whether a family lives in it or whether it's a public space like the one we're sitting in, you know, should be thought of as a place of encounter, obviously first of all between God and people, but then secondarily between people and one another. And the validity of a place encounter is not simply to be judged by its aesthetic beauty or the quality of its artisanship, but also by the degree to which it facilitates those relationships. So, you know, that's a condensed sort of theology and ethic of property.
Okay. Anyone else want to? Catherine?
Hello, I'm interested in your view about establishing relationships with tourists when they're with you for such a short time. What is the gift to the tourist coming to the church, and what's your hope for that relationship?
That's a wonderful question, and I think we could do a lot better at my institution. But in terms of our ministry to tourists, first of all, hospitality, a recognition that they will be safe. You know, terrorism is one of our biggest concerns on our risk register. A concern that they will get more than they came looking for. You know, an expectation that they'll receive more than they came looking for. In other words, if they simply come to the cafe, we need to find ways of directing them to the other things that are on offer. You know, there are something like 600 musical events, concerts and choral worship services at St Martin's in the course of a year. You know, we would be disappointed if anyone left the premises without having experienced something of that, because it's glorious. We also shape our life around tourists by doing a lot of things that you could call standalone events. So, for example, on a Thursday lunchtime, we do an event called Great Sacred Music, which is about words, and it's about choral music, and it brings out the theological and historical significance of maybe half a dozen choral pieces of music in about 35 minutes. That's specifically designed that it's still interesting if you come to it every week of the year, but it stands alone and it can work perfectly well in its own context. It also means in worship services we can't preach sermons or give announcements or shape the service simply for the congregation. You've got to assume there's always going to be 20 to 25% people there who will either never come again or don't speak the language, or, you know, those kind of things. It's got to be genuinely hospitable. So that, you know, that's the first principle. But the reason why I'm kind of feeling a little bit hesitant in answering the question is what we haven't done so well is find tangible ways in which those angels can bless us. Obviously they can bless us by spending at least twice as much as on average they currently do in the cafe, and by buying twice as many concert tickets and so on. But in terms of their cultural and faithful contribution, to me the most poignant is the prayers that they leave in the prayer box that we read out at morning prayer each day, because many of those are written by tourists and many of those are incredibly moving. I don't know if they're moving to God, but they're certainly moving to those of us who read the prayers out. I think I'm coming and going a little bit, aren't I? Anyway. Okay, I think I'm done.
Anyone else? Maybe in front, good job.
In the recent past, one thing that has been worrying me a lot is the way that the people of the Windrush generation have been treated. I am from Jamaica, and I was a child when people came from Britain to ask people from Jamaica to help rebuild Britain after the war. And now, so many years afterwards, I read that the people who came in that Windrush generation are being treated so dreadfully. I was wondering if this thing of generosity could be made to work, if the church were to put pressure on the government to be a little bit more fair-minded.
Yes, so if people didn't catch the question, it was about the Windrush generation, that whether the church should use such influence as it has to put pressure on the government to be more fair-minded to those who, in Jamaica particularly, but throughout the West Indies, were actually invited to come and requested to come and rebuild Britain after the war. Yeah, I mean, I think the where shall we start with this? There is one of the most painful things in human experience is to discover another person's ingratitude. And of course, ingratitude is the nicest way to describe it is it's based on forgetfulness. Just as I don't know how to guess what percentage of the British population would remember that a great number of the pilots that fought in the Battle of Britain were Polish. When people talk about Poles today, they talk about plumbers, and they talk about 500,000 Poles living in this country, and they talk about migrants, and they talk about a lot of things, but they don't talk about Polish pilots saving this country from invasion and oppression. So that's another form of ingratitude. Just, 10 years or so later, the Windrush, the Empress Windrush came over, and this country was, short of the kind of labour that was required. And that generation of people provided that kind of labour. And now, of course, we look back on the 50s as a time of social stability and growing prosperity and a great deal of church going. And in brackets, what we never say is a time when Britain was white. But actually that's on the list, we just never articulate it. But of course, why were the churches white? It was when people of the Windrush generation came to church, people told them to go away. Well, that's a great way to keep the church white. It's also turned out to be a fantastic way to shrink the church. So, the church has got its own, before the church lectures the government on gratitude and memory, the church has to put its own hand up and say, we were as complicit in this as anybody. It wasn't, it wasn't just those landlords who put up no dogs, no Irish, no blacks, no Jews, of whom there were obviously plenty, but actually churches, explicitly or more subtly put up the same placards as the landlords did. So, yes, it's an occasion for repentance and retelling of a truthful story, but actually before the church knocks on number 10 and says you should do something about this, the churches need to do that thing themselves.
Okay, behind the pillar, John, around that.
Thanks, Sam, for a very stimulating lecture. I'm interested in this idea that the financial challenges that we have are a potential source of blessing, and in particular, opening up a kind of the material dimensions of ecclesiology. Lots of people would say that the church talks too much about money, and I wonder whether there's a distinction to be made between a kind of anxiety about money, which we spend a lot of time concerned with, and thinking about money, which we don't do very well, and whether, if I'm hearing you right, you're calling us to a more creative reflection, and if we begin with where it touches the church most closely, then this is something that may also be an invitation to rethink a wider economy, and that Christian ethics maybe has been relatively quiet on the ethics of business and trade, and this may open out into that as well. Is that close to where you're trying to take us?
Yes, I think it can go in all sorts of directions like that. I mean, the place to begin theologically, I think, is with the word oikonomia, which means household management, which of course derives the word economics. And we are, the other place to begin, I think, is to say, why have we been so selective in the way we've talked about money? Because I guess that the crucial point in the story that I told tonight was the successors of Wesley and the two things that they didn't worry about that Wesley did worry about, one of which was how you make your money. If you speak to an organization like Business in the Community today, their whole ethos is about persuading companies that having a good record on corporate social responsibility and volunteering and giving money away is really the icing on the cake. The cake is being concerned about how you make your money. That's where the ethics are really, really happening. But there's not a lot of that in congregational preaching, for example. The congregational preaching is largely focused on, God rewards those who give 10% of their money to the church, which sounds like a kind of a bargain rather than grace to me. Well, of course it's not in the church's interest to preach the sermon that it's how you make your money that constitutes ethics rather than what you do with it, because we're back to the departure of the major donors that I referred to as being kind of the classic problem facing the mainline church in the States over the issues of the day. But yes, and what I'm trying to propose, and will become probably more explicit in the next lecture, trailer number 2, is that if the church is about what I try to outline in the first lecture, which is not scooping people up so that they get safely into heaven, so much as modeling what heaven looks like in our social relations today, if that's its primary purpose, then modeling what a civil economy, what an ecclesial economy might truly look like has got to be central to that, because money occupies such an enormous part of our lives. It pervades almost all of our lives. And it's getting away from, as I hinted at towards the end in talking about the history of the welfare state, this dualist spiritual material divide, where you could say that in 1948 the church said, we'll look after the spirit and you look after the body. Well, it turns out that most people think the body's the important part, and people have voted with their feet. So, but that's not a New Testament way of seeing the world. The church is about body and soul, if you even make such a distinction. Jesus is resurrected body and soul. So the kingdom of God is about body and soul. And so again, if you look at Matthew 25, when did you see me hungry, when did you see me thirsty, and so on, that's saying we meet Christ in our physical encounters and our tangible relationships one with another. And so if you take the logic of that forward, the body of Christ is discovered and is found to be risen in social relationships. So the church should be seeking to model a quality of social relationship more profound than is available elsewhere. Well, that's got to involve commercial activity.
Okay, Murray, want one last question, or 2 last questions?
When I was a little boy, I thought we were the good guys. British, that was good. We went to the Orient and we dealt with corruption, and we were the good guys. And it has been quite painful for me, starting in senior school, to begin to learn the extent to which that is a completely false picture. That we are perfidious Albion in the eyes of a large part of the world, that we take people and dump them. We used the Kurds and then we dumped them, we used the Gurkhas and then we dumped them. When the clearances were going up in the north and west, the church by and large said nothing. That we have a vast history of ill-doing which has produced for us a lot of wealth. The slave trade greatly enriched Glasgow, for example, and therefore, so how on earth do we cope with this appalling legacy of abuse from which we are still profiting?
We can take the other one, or should I respond to that one first? Yeah, I'll respond to this one first. Yes, well, I grew up in Bristol between 1740 and 1760. Bristol ships transported 500,000 Africans to across the Atlantic, slave trade. I thought I went to a very nice school in a very nice city, but no one at my school and in my city ever told me why it was a very nice city and a very nice school. And yet, when I went to university and found the answers to those questions, it had been the very nice school and the very nice city that had equipped me to get into that university, to find out the truth about my school and my university. And it's a little bit like that with growing up in the church and growing up in the United Kingdom, that we must give thanks for the institutions that have enabled us to discover the truth, and the fact that even though the truth isn't widely spoken about, it isn't actually suppressed, by the state or by the powerful forces in the same way as it is in other countries. So we do have things to be proud of and to be grateful for, but those very things that we are to be proud and grateful for enable us to see things that we're deeply ashamed of and profoundly regret. We obviously need to do better. I mean, if you contrast British foreign policy and French foreign policy, British foreign policy is somewhat obsessed with the idea that we are bringing civilization to the world. French foreign policy historically has been content with the fact it was bringing France to the world, and what could the world possibly want more than more and more of France? It didn't have to make that next step that said, and then France is civilized and honorable and things. It just said it's France, and that's great. So you could say that Britain is the hypocritical one of the two. I always say that hypocrisy is the least bad sin. It's much maligned. It's certainly by newspapers, tabloid newspapers, jump on it at every opportunity. I think it's the least bad sin because at least you're trying. At least you're setting an ideal to live up to. America is a profoundly hypocritical nation, but actually its times of redemption have been when its own people have pointed out its own hypocrisy, none more than Martin Luther King, who simply said, all I'm asking for is what you guys wrote in the Constitution 200 years ago. There's nothing that I want that's not there. So it's by pointing out hypocrisy that he actually won the argument. So if you're so frightened of being hypocritical, the opposite of that is not righteousness and truth, it's cynicism. So I think hypocrisy, opening yourself to the possible charge of hypocrisy is actually allowing a window of light through which goodness and righteousness may enter. That's not a popular or widely expressed view, but I think it does give us as a nation things to appeal to. So, for example, I think we do achieve renewal in our culture precisely, and I've already referred to it once tonight, by looking back at key events, of which two of the most unambiguous key British events happened within a few months of each other. I've mentioned the Battle of Britain, but are we truly a country fit for those heroes to live in? Was it worth those pilots giving their lives for the country we now are? Are we living up to those ideals? I think that's a powerful point to make. But also Dunkirk.
Dunkirk, every single little boat was needed to go across the channel. Are we truly a country that draws on the gifts of every little person in that country, or is it a country that's really just for a few people? So, I think we, despite the fact that we've got mixed feelings about a lot of our history, I think we can still look back to our history as a way of going forward, re-narrating our future in the light of becoming a people that our brave forebears could today be proud of.
One last one, Martin.
Thank you, Sam. That was great, and the questions have been great as well. This may actually just give you a chance for trailer number 3, so apologise for that. I was really struck in your lecture. You talked about how the model of economy that you've developed in St Martin's-in-the-Fields actually came out of crises. But in a way, it also comes out of opportunity. And so my question is probably, how does this economy, this model work in an economy which is so uneven? So actually, for all the struggles around St Martin's-in-the-Fields, it sits in the midst of an area where there are lots of people with lots of money. How does this model work in those locations where there is very little money swirling around within the local economy?
I think it's partly having a different attitude to opportunity. What I mean by that is to say, I'm not going to name a name, but let's imagine a former steel town or a former coal town, village, pit village, whatever it might be, that doesn't clearly have, a single employer to provide a major source of income for the town anymore. It's still got plenty of people living there. I'm not the great economist, but it doesn't take a great economist to see that it's in everybody's interest for those people to be spending money. You've got to create circumstances in which those people have got enough money in their pockets to make the local economy work. You can't. That's why all the anxiety about, well, not all the anxiety, but the fundamental anxiety about welfare and the welfare state is there's not enough money, people putting money in through taxes to pay out all the people that need benefits. That's why the economy has to work. So all I'm saying is we need a change of mind and heart to see people in such communities as profound assets rather than seeing the deficits of their lack of, you've got to start with people's assets. Now, of course, people in such situations have got fantastic assets, and they show them in their resilience and resourcefulness and how they get by on relatively little money with extraordinarily little support and opportunity, and yet they do get by. And one of the most interesting films in the last 5 years or so for me, I don't know if people have seen it, was the film called Pride, which talked about a group of people in Soho who got into a relationship with a bunch of South Wales former mining community, and initially they just despised one another, but they came to become friends and then to support each other in profound and public and sacrificial and transformative ways, because they started to see each other's assets rather than only see each other's deficits. So it seems to me that where the church needs to relocate its imagination, and this is what my book For Good, which is available on the table just over here, is about, is to understand what its role in the economy is. And I see the government's role as basically addressing deficits. There's no point in the church getting involved in unemployment benefit. I mean, that's just silly. But there are things in terms of cultivating a community's assets that the churches have,
have been doing for hundreds of years, that the government's frankly useless at. Providing community cafes, for example, we're non-profit social enterprises of that kind. Don't get the government to do that. That's just embarrassing. Nobody wants to be part of that. Get local, get people coming through your building as much as you can, even before you're asking questions about whether you're going to make any income from it, because the transformation of the fact that the people are being valued for who they are, rather than pitied for what they're not, is the crucial transformation that needs to be made. If you start seeing everybody who comes through the door as potentially somebody who's got to give you something, and it's your job to get to know them well enough to know what unique thing they're going to give you, then you've got the sort of change of heart that needs to happen, not just between church and society, but around the whole of the country.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions and for searching your mind and soul and heart, Sam, while we watch you. There's a chance now, we've got wine provided. You'll find this odd in Edinburgh, it's free. So a chance to share, chat, meet, talk, meet Sam informally. The bookstall is available. We hope to be able to do that in the next 35 minutes or so. Thank you for coming. We're back tomorrow evening, and then we have a week's break, and then we return on the 1st of October. And as I said earlier, you can see what you've missed, or see what you've seen and have another go at it by watching online. Just go to the Church of Scotland's website and the lectures will be there. So thank you. Let's meet together and hopefully see you all back either tomorrow or in the week that follows that. Thank you, Sam.